Revealed that the International Monetary Fund has suspended loan payments after the government broke the conditions for their disbursement. Some of those conditions would have led to increases in prices for rice and fuel, making the government very unpopular ahead of an election which is due in March. Patrick Smith is the editor of Africa Confidential, the publication that broke the story.
Ahead of the elections in Sierra Leone in March, it seems a big row has broken out between the government and the International Monetary Fund. The IMF signed a deal with the Sierra Leone government last year for $224 million. And that was premised on a group of pretty tough economic conditions. And by the end of the year, the IMF suspended its payments to the government, saying that it wasn't fulfilling the conditions. And the suspicion is that the government simply needed the first tranche to sort of bulk up the treasury, and then it announced a populist budget, which didn't meet any of those conditions, and has kind of engineered this crisis to help it out ahead of the elections.
How much money is involved?
It's a total of $224 million in the IMF loan. But that's going to be made available over a 4-year period. So initially, they got about $50 million for the first tranche of that.
So potentially $50 million might be being misused.
It's not so much misused as the IMF are saying, well, you signed on to this deal, but you didn't meet the conditions. So are you really serious about the deal, or is it just convenience ahead of the elections? Because it was a sort of contribution to the Treasury, if you like.
Okay, so what are the conditions that were not being met?
Well, there's a whole raft of them. I mean, and they're pretty harsh. The IMF wanted Sierra Leone to cut rice subsidies, fuel subsidies. It wanted to eliminate many so-called discretionary waivers on import taxes, so to push up the prices of imports, essentially, to impose a 20% tax, import tax on imported vehicles worth more than $25,000, which is most vehicles these days. And the government wasn't having that. Certainly the idea of removing subsidies on rice and fuel 3 months ahead of an election is going to be politically explosive. All this has come out because one of our correspondents saw the contents of a confidential dispatch from the U.S. Embassy in Freetown to headquarters in Washington. And this dispatch claimed that relations between the government of Ernest Bai Koroma and the IMF had reached absolute rock bottom.
And the reason for that was that the IMF was saying, we're not giving you any more money.
Yep, they've suspended the loan to Sierra Leone, and they want to have further negotiations about what conditions the government is prepared to keep to resume funding.
So has this been confirmed with the IMF? Have they told you that they've done that?
The IMF are absolutely stum. They announced that the credit was being suspended, but they're not getting into, as far as their talks with journalists are at least, they're not getting into the reasons for this. Just say they're having an ongoing dialogue with the government, and that's it.
And the government itself, have they said anything?
No, they haven't reacted yesterday. The story came out, and we've had a lot of reaction from civil society in Sierra Leone, but nothing from the government yet, not a denial or an affirmation so far. I mean, it's a matter of fact that the loan is suspended, but the reasons for it haven't been discussed by the government yet.
And your report says that the EU is also withholding funds. Is that the case?
That's right. The EU has also taken issue with the Koroma government on a number of policy matters, mainly to do with accountability and transparency of the funds coming in from the EU. So it seems that there's quite a lot of Western pressure on the Koroma government ahead of these elections at the moment. Of course, Koroma himself has chosen his own foreign minister, Samu Kamara, as his candidate for the elections. And I suppose the feeling is he wants to put him in the best possible economic position to win those elections. And he's not going to do it if he starts cutting subsidies on vital commodities or putting up taxes ahead of the election.
That's Patrick Smith, editor of Africa Confidential, and we're hoping to hear from the Sierra Leonean government in the next edition of Focus on Africa. Coming up...